During a measles outbreak in a nearby lumber camp, Sister Margaret treated dozens of workers regardless of faith. But behind the stone walls, something was beginning to shift. The convent had begun receiving small donations from appreciative families, and even local Protestant ministers acknowledged the positive work being done behind its stone walls. But outside recognition didn't reflect what was quietly shifting within. Life at St. Mary's was changing in unsettling ways. Communal meals, once a time for quiet conversation, had grown silent. The sisters now ate with their eyes lowered, focused only on their bowls of thin soup or dry bread. Recreation, which had once included soft laughter or shared stories, became stiff and subdued. The camaraderie among women who had once crossed an ocean together was fading. Now they moved through the halls like shadows, careful, quiet, and guarded. The first odd event occurred in April 1855, when Sister Agnes didn't appear for morning prayers. Her absence stood out immediately. One empty space in a chapel where 20 women usually stood in perfect formation. The other nuns exchanged brief, uneasy glances as Mother Catherine entered, her face unreadable in the dim candlelight. "Sister Agnes has been called to assist with our mission in Minnesota," she announced at breakfast. Her voice left no room for discussion. The decision came swiftly, as such callings often do. "Let us pray for her success." Sister Bernadette's spoon slipped against her bowl, but she didn't say anything to me. She began, her voice uncertain. Mother Catherine's pale eyes turned sharply toward her. "Are you implying, Sister Bernadette, that a bride of Christ must seek her peers' approval before answering God's will?" A long pause followed. "No, Mother," Bernadette murmured, eyes downcast. "Forgive me, no one had seen Agnes pack or say goodbye." She hadn't mentioned anything about a transfer in her letters home. But in the strict hierarchy of convent life, questioning the Mother Superior was simply not done. That evening, a few sisters noticed Agnes's small belongings were missing: her prayer book, a wooden rosary from her mother, and extra wool stockings for the cold. It seemed she had packed, yet Sister Mary Collins, who slept beside Agnes, whispered later to Sister Teresa Donovan, her cloak was still hanging on the peg. Why would she leave without it, especially for Minnesota? In April, Teresa glanced back toward the convent windows. "Maybe they gave her a new one," she said, hesitant. "We shouldn't speculate." 3 months later, Sister Bernadette vanished in the same manner. "The bishop has requested her help with a matter in Chicago," Mother Catherine explained. She left early to catch the train. No goodbyes, no notice, just another empty bed. Later, Sister Elizabeth offered more detail during chores. She showed such talent with the children. "The bishop wants her to help train others at the new foundling home." Her tone was calm, but Sister Mary noticed her eyes had lost their usual warmth. By that winter, 3 more nuns had been transferred. Each case followed the same script. A young woman often noted for her beauty or kindness would disappear. Mother Catherine would announce a new assignment, always far enough away to make checking difficult. Letters sent by family members were returned months later with formal responses that lacked detail. Later handwriting analysis would reveal all those letters had been written by the same person, not the missing women themselves. Sister Teresa Donovan was one of the few who dared to speak openly. Strong from years of farm work before joining the convent, she wasn't afraid of asking questions. Her open doubts had already drawn Mother Catherine's disapproval. "It doesn't make sense," she whispered to Sister Mary one day as they harvested carrots. "All these transfers, yet no proper records." The garden had grown that year, with a new herb section fenced off and accessible only to Sister Margaret and Mother Catherine. "Have you noticed it's always the youngest and most lovely who are sent away?" Teresa added, her Irish accent deepening with emotion. "First Agnes, with her golden hair, then Bernadette and her singing voice, Catherine with that perfect skin, Josephine." She stopped suddenly. A shadow had moved across the garden path. Sister Mary glanced up and saw Sister Margaret standing by the convent window, her expression unreadable. "We shouldn't talk like this," Mary said quickly. Mother Catherine must have her reasons. A week later, Sister Teresa was gone. The official word was a retreat in Montreal. Sister Mary, now deeply alarmed, kept her head down. That evening, as she made her bed, She found a torn page from Teresa's prayer book tucked under her pillow. Scribbled in the margin was a single message: "Something is wrong. If I disappear, tell Father Ryan." The sight of the familiar handwriting chilled Mary. More than the cold air creeping through the stones. By 1857, the pattern was undeniable. Of the original 20 young nuns, only 12 remained. Each new explanation sounded just like the last: missions, illness, special assignments. But inside the convent, fear had taken hold. The remaining sisters spoke in hushed tones, avoided being alone, and watched nervously as their numbers dwindled. Mother Catherine's rule grew harsher. Even minor infractions now led to severe penances: long fasts, nights spent kneeling in the chapel, public confessions that grew more humiliating. When Sister Claire O'Donnell was caught with a small chocolate bar sent by her family, she was forced to confess before the others and sentenced to 3 days on water and a single piece of bread. She fainted during prayers on the second day. Sister Margaret revived her with smelling salts. Her mouth curved slightly into what some later recalled as a smile. One bitterly cold night in January 1858, Sister Mary Collins was woken by muffled sounds coming from the next room, through the thin wall. She heard Sister Rebecca Murphy sobbing, and then Mother Catherine's voice, low but firm: "You'll come with us now. Make a sound, and you'll regret it." There was shuffling, then silence. 3 sets of footsteps moved away. Then a muffled cry quickly silenced and the unmistakable drag of something heavy along the floor. The next morning, Mother Catherine calmly told the sisters that Rebecca had been sent to the Dakota Territory to help educate Native children. "She's well suited to such work," she said. "We will miss her." Her gaze briefly rested on Sister Mary. Mary, terrified, held herself together through the day's prayers. Her hands trembled as she counted her rosary beads. That afternoon, while sweeping outside Mother Catherine's office, she overheard a conversation through the partially open door. "The doctor says this one will bring in more," said Sister Elizabeth. Her voice, usually warm, now sounded cold and calculating. "He says men pay extra for the innocent ones. We need to space them out better," replied Sister Margaret, glass clinking as she worked. 3 in 1 month draws attention. The bishop's secretary even mentioned it. "The bishop's easily handled," Mother Catherine said with a dry laugh. "A little extra for his cathedral fund, and he stops asking questions. Our story holds. Who questions a nun being sent on a mission or dying from illness?" "What about Collins?" Sister Margaret asked. "She watches everything, listens at doors." There was a pause. "We'll wait," Mother Catherine replied. "She's to plan to bring much, and her brother in the seminary would notice. Rebecca should be enough for now." Mary fled before they could catch her listening. Panic and realization crashed over her. The missing nuns, the secret visits from wealthy benefactors, the locked north wing, the convent's growing funds. Despite no visible source, the next morning, during her egg-collecting duties, the only time she was unsupervised, Mary made her move. As she passed Jimmy Fletcher, the milk boy, she slipped a note into his coat pocket and pressed a small silver cross into his hand. "Take this to Father Thomas at St. Joseph's. Don't tell anyone else, please," she whispered. The note was simple: "Something terrible is happening at St. Mary's. Nuns are vanishing. I fear I'm next. Please help." Father Thomas Ryan, a young priest, had long felt uneasy about the convent. During his visits, he'd noticed the decreasing number of sisters and vague responses from Mother Catherine. But as a low-ranking priest, he had little authority. Holding the silver cross, clearly a cherished gift, he knew the note was genuine. But how could he act? He didn't confront Mother Catherine. Instead, he rode to Milwaukee to speak with Bishop John Henney. The journey took a full day. He arrived exhausted but determined. At first, the bishop was more interested in showing blueprints for the new cathedral than hearing concerns. But when Father Ryan finally raised the issue, the bishop's demeanor changed. "These are serious accusations," he said. "Mother Catherine has provided explanations that satisfy me. But 8 nuns have disappeared," Father Ryan pushed. "No documentation, no real communication after they're transferred. The frontier needs strong women," the bishop replied, standing. "Let's not spread rumors that could harm the church's standing." Mother Catherine has been generous to our building fund. Her leadership is sound. Dismissed. Father Ryan left frustrated, but not defeated. In March 1858, he found an opportunity. Assigned to collect financial reports from religious institutions, he now had a reason to formally examine the convent's records. As he approached St. Mary's, the convent looked different: neglected gardens, fewer lit windows. The bell rang less often, and when it did, its sound was faint. Sister Elizabeth met him at the door, her appearance more disheveled than usual. "We weren't expecting you," she said. "Mother Catherine is unavailable," she added, leading him to a cold side room. "I was instructed to review the records personally," Father Ryan said. Setting down his case, Sister Elizabeth hesitated. "Our bookkeeper, Sister Margaret, is tending a sick child." "I'll wait," he replied. "Or perhaps toward the orphanage." Her reaction was brief but telling. "As you wish, but please avoid the north wing. There's influenza." As he toured, what he saw troubled him. The orphanage, supposedly full, housed only 7 frail-looking children. The infirmary had just 3 elderly patients. Sister Margaret was nowhere to be found. Even the number of nuns had dropped; only 8 remained, compared to 15 just months earlier. He asked casually about Sister Mary. "She was sent to St. Louis," Elizabeth replied. Her skills were needed. The author of the note gone. Finally, he asked to visit the chapel. Once spotless, it now showed signs of neglect: dusty altar rails, tarnished candlesticks, and wilted flowers. Own cells under constant watch while the church coordinated with civil authorities. News of the scandal broke within days. The story quickly spread beyond Wisconsin, shaking the American Catholic community to its core. Local newspapers reported the grim details, and national headlines soon followed, calling it one of the darkest chapters in the Church's history in the United States. Public outrage was swift and intense. A formal inquiry was launched, and by the end of 1858, a joint investigation between church officials and state authorities had compiled hundreds of pages of testimony, financial records, and physical evidence. Charges were filed against all 3 women, not just for fraud and conspiracy, but for abduction, abuse, and murder. The man known as Callahan was later identified as an ex-convict hired to enforce obedience through violence. The trials were long and heavily attended. Witnesses testified behind closed doors to protect their identities and mental well-being. Several of the rescued nuns were relocated to monasteries far from the Midwest and given new names to begin new lives. Some recovered enough to return to religious service. Others never did. Sister Mary Collins, whose desperate note had set the entire investigation in motion, left convent life entirely. She eventually settled in Illinois, where she worked quietly as a midwife. She never spoke publicly about what she had endured, but in her later years, she donated her confirmation cross to a local church with the inscription, "For the protection of the innocent, let none be silenced." Father Ryan remained at St. Joseph's for several more years, though shaken. He became known for his steadfast support of women in religious life and his commitment to transparency within the church. Archbishop Hughes publicly praised his courage, and in time, Father Ryan was appointed to a senior position overseeing religious communities throughout the region. St. Mary's Convent was never reopened. The limestone building was eventually torn down, the ground blessed and left fallow. No new structure was ever built on the site, and yet, stories persisted. Locals claimed they could still hear faint prayers in the wind, or catch glimpses of veiled figures moving between the trees. On moonless nights, for some, the horror faded with time. For others, it never quite went away. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with us through one of America's hidden historical tragedies. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this dark, often forgotten, but never without meaning. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind. We're abruptly halted after church officials intervened, citing concerns over religious freedom and the potential for anti-Catholic backlash. Though a few brothels were quietly shut down, no arrests were made. The women involved were either relocated or returned to convents, their stories left unrecorded and their trauma ignored. In the years that followed, the Catholic Church made internal adjustments to tighten oversight of religious institutions, but these reforms were mostly administrative and largely shielded from public view. A new generation of bishops quietly implemented stricter rules for convent inspections and orphanage placements, while avoiding any reference to the scandal that prompted these changes. By the early 1870s, public memory of the St. Mary's case had already begun to fade. The official church histories made no mention of the events, and secular newspapers moved on to new controversies. In Catholic school curricula, the convent was remembered only as a failed mission. Due to administrative mismanagement, no mention was made of the victims or their suffering. Still, traces of the truth remained. A few surviving copies of the dark convent circulated in secret among reform-minded clergy and social workers. In whispered conversations, the names of Sister Rebecca and Father Ryan were spoken with reverence by those who believed the Church should do more to protect the vulnerable and confront its failures. Historians who stumbled upon fragments of the story in private letters, court documents, or archived journals often found their inquiries blocked or dismissed. Church records were sealed, witnesses had passed away, and much of the evidence had been deliberately destroyed or lost. Yet the story refused to die completely. Occasionally, rumors resurfaced of nuns gone missing in strange circumstances, of convents harboring secrets too dark for public exposure, of a master figure said to operate in the shadows, always one step ahead of discovery. And so, the legacy of St. Mary's lingered hidden, but not forgotten, buried, but never erased. It stands as a grim reminder of what can happen when power is abused, when silence is enforced, and when institutions choose image over accountability. If you found this story as haunting as we did, consider sharing it. These are the chapters of history that demand to be remembered not for their darkness alone, but to honor the light that tried to break through. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the margins of history. We're even more aggressively silenced. Monsignor Kelly, who had led the original investigation at St. Mary's, traveled to St. Louis in 1859 following leads that suggested as many as 7 missing nuns from the convent had been trafficked to brothels there within days of arriving. He was assaulted by unknown attackers and warned to leave the city. He survived but was quickly recalled by Archbishop Hughes, ending the inquiry. Private letters between Kelly and Hughes, later unsealed in the New York Diocese archives in 1950, reveal his growing concern. "I fear we've only uncovered the surface of something much deeper," he wrote. "This reaches far into society and perhaps even the Church itself. Powerful interests seem determined to see this case buried. For the survivors, the consequences were lasting." The 12 nuns rescued from St. Mary's faced a world that was unprepared to deal with their trauma. Even those not physically abused had endured years of fear, silence, and complicity. Some had been forced to help in acts they found horrifying, under threat of punishment. Sister Claire O'Donnell, who was coerced into restraining Sister Teresa during her murder, showed symptoms that today would be recognized as severe PTSD. Sent to a convent in Philadelphia, she was repeatedly disciplined for outbursts and nightmares. Records show she left religious life soon after and was briefly institutionalized. She then vanished from the record entirely. 5 women sisters, Rebecca Murphy, Josephine Brady, Claire O'Donnell, Maria Fitzpatrick, and Anne Sullivan, had suffered the worst abuses. Their paths reflect how poorly the Church handled trauma. Sister Josephine's suicide, following the forced adoption of her child, has already been noted. Sister Maria Fitzpatrick stayed within the Church, but was described as emotionally unstable. She joined a silent order and died in 1870, recorded only as having succumbed to nervous exhaustion. Sister Anne Sullivan responded differently. Though bound by her vows, she quietly created support systems for nuns who had experienced abuse. Letters found in her Boston convent after her death in 1899 show her resolve to protect others from similar harm. "We must learn to separate faith from those who misuse it," she wrote in 1875. "What happened to us was not divine, it was human cruelty cloaked in holiness. Our duty now is to ensure such garments are never so easily stolen again." 1. Of the darkest unknowns remains the full number of victims. The Church confirmed 23 nuns and 17 orphan girls as trafficked or murdered, but Sister Elizabeth's notebook mentioned others: rural acquisitions from isolated farms and settlements. Many were never reported missing. Their absence is explained away by relocation or family assumptions. Local newspapers from the time contain brief mentions of young women disappearing from areas near St. Mary's Maids who returned east, daughters who married and moved west, or widows who sought work in the city. How many were actually trafficked through the Convent's network is still unclear. An entry from October 1857 reads, "Rural acquisitions this year, 14. Superior quality, primarily Scandinavian. Special commission from New Orleans fulfilled." Of the 23 nuns believed to have vanished between 1854 and 1858, only 9 were ever found for buried on the convent grounds, and 5 rescued later. The remaining 14 were likely sold to operations in distant cities like New Orleans, San Francisco, or possibly abroad. None were ever officially recovered. A small clue came in 1872 when a Catholic missionary in San Francisco met a woman in a brothel who claimed she had once been Sister Catherine Walsh of St. Mary's. By the time officials arrived, she had died of typhoid fever and been buried in an unmarked grave. Though her identity was never confirmed, her story matched the known facts. The biggest unanswered question still revolves around Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark, the women behind it all. How they first entered religious life remains murky. Records suggest that Catherine Donovan, Sister Margaret's real name, had briefly joined a convent in Ireland before being expelled for vague moral reasons. She likely met her partner in crime in America during the 1840s, and together they saw the growing Catholic infrastructure as the perfect cover for their scheme. After St. Mary's was exposed, their escape sparked one of the largest but quietest manhunts. In pre-Civil War America, the Church kept things discreet to avoid scandal. Reported sightings placed them in New Orleans, Havana, and Mexico City, always tied to religious or charity institutions catering to the wealthy. The last credible lead came from a former Chicago police detective hired by the New York Diocese. His 1863 report placed the 2 women in Veracruz, Mexico, running a finishing school for young ladies, an operation he believed mirrored their past work. The report ends grimly. Murphy and Clark have likely re-established their business, protected by powerful patrons. I was violently warned to stop. 2 local officials assisting me were found dead the morning of our inspection. These women are shielded at the highest levels. The fallout from St. Mary's went beyond individual suffering. It deepened anti-Catholic sentiment in mid-19th century America. Protestant papers used the scandal, often exaggerated, to push claims of moral corruption in Catholic institutions. In turn, Catholic communities grew more insular and defensive, unintentionally reinforcing the culture of secrecy that enabled the abuse in the first place. More importantly, the case established a pattern in how institutions respond to abuse. One echoed in later scandals: initial inquiries, narrow accountability, protection of those in power, silencing of victims, and a return to business as usual without systemic change. In a sealed letter to Vatican officials uncovered only in 1975, Archbishop Hughes acknowledged the Church's failure. "We've removed the source of scandal," he wrote, "but the system that allowed it remains flawed. I urge a thorough review of how authority is appointed and supervised." His recommendation was quietly shelved. The Church's preference for discreet, internal handling of such matters would persist for over a century. Physically, little remains of the St. Mary's site. The buildings were torn down, and over time the land was resold and developed. Today, a quiet suburban neighborhood stands where those horrors unfolded, its residents unaware of the past buried beneath their feet. Church records from the era were heavily edited or destroyed, and even the nuns' graves were left unmarked, eventually built over with no consecration. Still, the truth endures. Scattered letters, archived newspapers, and oral histories many passed down in Catholic families in Wisconsin tell fragments of the story. Together, they reveal not just what happened at St. Mary's, but how systems can fail, the dangers of unchecked power, the risks to the isolated and vulnerable, and the ability of some to exploit even sacred institutions for personal gain. Father Thomas Ryan, who first uncovered the truth, left behind a journal. In his final entry, he pleaded, "Remember them. Remember that they lived and that they suffered. Their pain mattered." By revisiting this story even in fragments, we honor that plea, and perhaps we learn something about how to keep such abuses from happening again. The Wisconsin Historical Society still holds a small collection of materials from the St. Mary's case, available only to approved researchers. Among them is a water-damaged letter from Sister Sullivan, dated 1880. It was addressed to the now-adult daughter of Sister Josephine Brady, the child taken from her mother at birth. It was never sent, as Sister could not find the woman, but her final lines remain, "If you ever learn where you came from, know this. Your mother was not ashamed. She was brave. What happened at St. Mary's was not from God, nor from true faith. It was human cruelty cloaked in sacred robes. The real convent was not the stone walls, but the women, who held each other up in darkness, who whispered prayers, who remembered names when everything else was taken, who still believed in salvation, even when it felt distant. That is what I hope you inherit, not our suffering, but our strength." This story reminds us that the worst evil can hide behind holy facades, and that silence can let it fester for generations. What do you think? Was everything truly uncovered? Or are there still secrets buried beneath Wisconsin soil? The Cardinal acknowledged receiving the documents in a short letter to Mary Callahan, assuring her that appropriate steps would be taken, but no public inquiry followed, and the documents vanished into church archives. "I have reviewed the materials you sent," Cardinal Gibbons wrote in a personal letter preserved in Callahan's family papers. "While I share your horror at what they reveal, I must weigh the harm that public exposure might inflict on the faith of countless innocent Catholics. The main perpetrators have already met divine judgment. The victims, we trust, have found peace. Perhaps the best way forward is to let this darkness remain buried while making sure it never happens again." Mary Callahan's later attempts to bring the documents to light were repeatedly blocked. Newspaper editors declined to publish her account, citing insufficient evidence. When she tried to self-publish a pamphlet, her printer abruptly backed out after a visit from men in clerical robes. Her home was broken into twice, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Eventually, in 1892, she passed copies of the most important documents to her nephew, instructing him to keep them safe for future generations. Then, in 1908, a fire broke out in the Baltimore Archdiocesan Records Room, destroying a large number of historical files, reportedly including the entire Callahan collection. Church officials called it an unfortunate accident, but former employees later claimed the fire was unusually targeted. Thomas Moran, a former archivist, gave a deathbed statement to his son in 1947. "I was told to store those documents all in one place, against standard archival practice," he said. "When the fire broke out, it burned only that section. Nothing else was touched. Draw your own conclusions." The last confirmed development in the St. Mary's case came in 1912. Workers renovating a long-abandoned mansion in Veracruz, Mexico, found a concealed room containing the mummified remains of two elderly women. Among their belongings were religious items, fake identification under various names, and large sums of American and Mexican currency. Most striking was a golden locket showing a miniature painting of St. Mary's Convent as it looked in the 1850s, according to La Verdad de Veracruz on March 12, 1912. The bodies were seated in chairs facing each other, with teacups set before them. Tests revealed the tea contained a powerful plant-based poison. Whether the women died by suicide or were murdered was never determined. Mexican authorities, unsure of the significance, shared their findings with U.S. newspapers. Several surviving nuns from St. Mary's, by then elderly, identified some of the recovered items as belonging to Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark. It appears the two women lived out their final years in wealth and isolation, never leaving behind the secrets they carried. A journal found with the bodies revealed even more disturbing information. Its entries indicated that their trafficking operation continued in Mexico for nearly 20 years. Notes about acquisitions, placements, and special clients mirrored language seen in the original St. Mary's records. The final entry, dated the apparent day of their deaths, read, "He comes tonight. We have failed him for the last time." Whether this he referred to a human partner or something else remains unclear. Some researchers point to fringe religious groups tied to elite circles during the late 1800s. Others suspect it was a cryptic reference to a powerful figure. Behind their operation, the horrors didn't end there. Investigators searching the grounds of the Veracruz estate found the remains of at least 12 young women buried in the garden. Documents showed these women had been promised jobs or religious training, only to meet fates similar to those of the nuns back in Wisconsin. The evil that began in Wisconsin didn't stop there. The New York Times wrote in a rare article about the case. It merely relocated like a disease finding new ground. The paper wondered aloud how many similar operations might still exist behind polished facades. The American Catholic Church responded briefly, acknowledging that 2 individuals once connected to a disbanded Wisconsin community had been identified in Mexico, but it emphasized that they had been excommunicated and were acting without the Church's sanction. The trafficking and abuse were not mentioned today. A quiet memorial garden in Milwaukee serves as the only public remembrance of the St. Mary's victims. Established in 2010 by an anonymous donor, the garden has no official church support and no plaques with names. Yet every spring, flowers appear at the site left, some believe, by descendants of Sister Mary Collins, whose smuggled note exposed the truth. Independent researchers trying to study the case have encountered repeated setbacks. Records vanish from archives just before appointments. Research permissions are suddenly revoked. Some scholars report break-ins, where only research materials are disturbed. Others describe threatening calls, or even being followed by unknown men. Someone still doesn't want this story fully told. Historian Rebecca Lawson wrote in her 2003 article, Buried Secrets, The Unfinished Investigation of St. Mary's Convent, whether it's to protect the reputations of powerful families or to shield the church. Efforts to obscure this chapter continue. The Wisconsin countryside has long covered over the land where St. Mary's once stood. New homes, new churches, and new lives have taken root, unaware of what once happened beneath the soil. But some locals claim that on foggy autumn nights, when the wind moves just right, they can hear faint sounds, prayers whispered on the breeze, or something more chilling. In 2018, construction crews digging for a new home near the old convent site unearthed a small metal box. Inside was a rosary, a folded veil, and a handwritten list of names, 23 in total, with a simple inscription, "Remember us." The box was turned over to the diocesan archives, where it remains today and cataloged and closed to public research. The family of Jimmy Fletcher, the farm boy who delivered Sister Mary's letter to Father Ryan, has kept their own tribute. For 5 generations, they've maintained a shelf in their farmhouse kitchen with a silver cross said to have been given to Jimmy by Sister Mary. Beside it, they keep a handwritten list of the victims' names, updated as new details emerge. Great-great-grandpa Jimmy told us to never forget those women, said Robert Fletcher in a 2020 interview. He said just because the truth gets buried doesn't mean it isn't real. Those women lived. They suffered. They mattered. There's no denying that between 1854 and 1862, inside what was meant to be a sacred space, a terrible wrong was allowed to unfold. That it happened at all, and that the systems meant to protect the vulnerable instead enabled the abuse, is a sobering reminder of how institutions can fail. Perhaps the deepest horror of St. Mary's isn't just the abuse itself, but how easily it was erased. The limestone walls came down, the stories nearly vanished, but the names remain. Remember Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, and all the others. Remember that they lived, that they suffered, and that their suffering mattered.